My name is Christina, and I'm 24 years old. Christmas dinner just turned into a nightmare when my stepfather announced I was out of the family and wouldn't be getting any presents. Real family shares blood, he said while my mother stayed silent. I grabbed my coat and left, but what happened the next morning changed everything forever. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt rejected by the people who were supposed to love you. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to how this whole mess started. When I was 15, my parents' marriage fell apart like a house of cards. Dad was a contractor, Mom worked part-time at a dental office, and their fights could wake the neighbors 3 blocks away. The divorce was brutal, but there was one silver lining that seemed like a blessing at the time. During the settlement negotiations, Dad made a decision that surprised everyone. "I want the house to go to Christina," he told the lawyers. Mom's jaw dropped. She'd been worried about where she'd live since the house had been Dad's before they married, meaning she had no claim to it in the divorce. "This way," Dad explained, "Christina always has a home and you can live there with her until she's older." It seemed perfect. I'd inherit my childhood home, Mom wouldn't have to scramble for housing, and Dad could walk away knowing his daughter was secure. The paperwork was filed, the deed transferred, and just like that, at 15 I became a homeowner. Not that it felt real at the time. I was just relieved my parents had stopped screaming at each other every night and that Mom seemed genuinely happy about the arrangement. Dad moved into a small apartment across town. He'd pick me up every other weekend, take me to dinner at that diner he loved, always ordering the same turkey sandwich and asking about school. He wasn't perfect, but he tried to stay involved even after the chaos of the divorce. 2 years later, everything changed again. Dad had a heart attack while working a job site. 47 years old, gone in an instant. The funeral was small, just Mom, me, a handful of his work buddies, and his sister from Oregon who I barely knew. As his only child, I inherited what little he had. His truck, some tools, and about $30,000 he'd somehow managed to save. Mom helped me open a college fund with most of it. "Your father wanted you to have opportunities he never had," she said, her eyes still red from crying. High school graduation came and went. I'd gotten into State University 3 hours away, planning to study business administration. Nothing fancy, but it was my ticket to something bigger than our small town. Mom seemed proud, taking dozens of photos of me in my cap and gown in front of the house that now legally belonged to me. "I'm going to miss you so much," she said, hugging me tight that August morning as I loaded my car for freshman year. "But this house will always be here waiting for you to come home." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? It was my house after all. I had the deed to prove it. College was everything I'd hoped for. Freedom to make my own decisions, classes that actually interested me, friends who didn't know every embarrassing thing I'd done since kindergarten. I threw myself into campus life, joining the business club, working part-time at the campus bookstore, building a life that felt entirely my own. I called Mom every Sunday, listening to her stories about work, the neighbors, the small dramas of small-town life. She sounded good, busy but content. Sometimes she'd mention missing Dad, but mostly she seemed to be moving forward. I was proud of how strong she'd become. Winter break of my sophomore year, I packed my car with dirty laundry and Christmas presents, excited to spend 3 weeks in my childhood bedroom. The drive home always felt surreal, watching familiar landmarks appear as the highway wound through farmland and into town. But as I pulled into our driveway, something felt different. The front porch had been repainted a pale yellow instead of the white I remembered. New curtains hung in the living room windows. Mom must have been redecorating, I thought. Good for her. I grabbed my bags and headed for the front door, key in hand. Before I could even knock, the door swung open, and Mom practically bounced out to meet me. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, and she had this glow I hadn't seen since before the divorce. "Honey, I'm so glad you're home. I have the most wonderful surprise to tell you." That's when I noticed her profile as she turned to grab one of my bags. My mother, who had been single for 3 years, was definitely pregnant. The living room looked like a furniture showroom had exploded. Everything was different. The old brown couch Dad had refused to replace was gone, replaced by a beige sectional that probably cost more than my car. New coffee table, new lamps, even new family photos on the walls that I didn't remember taking. "Mom, are you—" I started, but she was practically glowing with excitement. "Pregnant, yes!" She laughed, spinning around with her hands on her belly. 5 months along. Can you believe it? I couldn't believe it. My brain was still processing the redecorated house, and now I was supposed to absorb that my 42-year-old mother was having another baby. But how? I mean, when? "You never mentioned—" "That's the other surprise," she said, her voice dropping to something that sounded almost shy. "There's someone I want you to meet." Heavy footsteps came down the stairs, and I looked up to see a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that stretched tight across his belly. His hair was thinning on top, and he had this expression like he owned the place, which apparently he thought he did. "Christina, this is Frank," Mom said, rushing over to take his arm. "My husband." Husband. The word hit me like a slap. Not boyfriend, not fiancé. Husband. Frank extended a meaty hand toward me, his grip firm enough to make a point. "So you're the college girl," he said, looking me up and down like he was appraising livestock. "Your mother's told me all about you." Something in his tone made my skin crawl, but Mom was watching us both with such hopeful excitement that I forced a smile. "Nice to meet you, Frank. We got married 6 weeks ago," Mom rushed to explain. "Just a small ceremony at the courthouse. I know I should have told you, but everything happened so fast and I didn't want to distract you from finals. 6 weeks ago. While I was stressing about organic chemistry and business law, my mother had married a complete stranger and moved him into my house. The house my father had specifically left to me. It's wonderful news," I managed, though my voice sounded hollow even to my ears. "I'm happy for you, Mom." Frank's arm went around Mom's shoulders, pulling her close in a way that seemed more possessive than affectionate. "Your mother needed someone to take care of her," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "This house was too much for a woman alone. The house was mine." I wanted to remind him of that fact, but Mom looked so radiant, so genuinely happy for the first time since Dad died. I swallowed my objections and tried to focus on that. "Tell me everything," I said, settling onto the new couch that felt nothing like home. "How did you two meet?" Mom launched into the story with enthusiasm that reminded me of when I was little and she'd read me fairy tales. Frank worked construction, like Dad had. They'd met when his crew was hired to fix the Henderson family's roof after the spring storms. He'd asked her out for coffee. She'd said yes, and things moved quickly from there. "He's been so good to me," she said, her hand finding Frank's. "After your father died, I thought I'd never feel complete again, but Frank showed me I could have a second chance at happiness." Frank nodded along to her story, but I caught him studying the living room like he was taking inventory. His gaze lingered on the new entertainment system, the expensive-looking rug, the fresh coat of paint on walls that hadn't needed painting. "The place needed a man's touch," he said when he caught me looking. "Your mother had let things slide a bit." That stung. Mom had maintained the house perfectly well for 3 years. Sure, she hadn't renovated or redecorated, but everything had been clean and functional and exactly the way I remembered growing up. "I like what you've done with it," I lied, because Mom's face was so bright with pride. "Frank has such good taste," she said, "and he's so handy around the house. He fixed that leak in the kitchen sink that had been driving me crazy, painted the whole exterior, even put in that new porch light, all improvements to my property that I'd never authorized." But Mom seemed so grateful, so happy to have someone taking care of her again. I reminded myself that the important thing was her well-being, not the legalities of who owned what. "When's the baby due?" I asked, trying to shift the conversation to safer ground. "April," Mom said, rubbing her belly with obvious excitement. "Dr. Martinez thinks it might be twins based on the size, but we won't know for sure until the next ultrasound." Twins? Jesus. I was trying to wrap my head around one new sibling, and now there might be 2. "That's incredible," I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I was excited about being a big sister. I'd always wanted siblings growing up. Frank's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with a frown. "My boys are coming for dinner Sunday," he announced. "Hope that's all right with you, honey." His boys. Frank had children from a previous relationship, apparently. This family dynamic was getting more complicated by the minute. "Of course," Mom said quickly. "Christina will love meeting them." Would I? I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own house, surrounded by people I didn't know making decisions about my life without consulting me. But looking at my mother's face, glowing with happiness and hope for the future, I knew I had to try. This was her chance at a fresh start, a complete family, the kind of happiness she'd thought was lost forever. "I can't wait to meet them," I said, and hoped it would eventually be true. Sunday dinner was my first real glimpse into what life with Frank's family would look like, and let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. His boys turned out to be Jake, 16, and Danny, 13, both clearly uncomfortable being there and making sure everyone knew it. Jake had Frank's build, but with teenager attitude cranked to 11. He slouched into the house like he was doing us all a favor, barely grunted when Mom tried to introduce herself, and immediately claimed the TV remote like he lived there. Danny was quieter, but kept shooting suspicious looks at everything, like he was calculating what he could pocket when nobody was looking. "Boys, say hello to Christina," Frank commanded from his spot at the head of what used to be my family's dining table. "She's in college." "Cool," Jake muttered, without looking up from his phone. Danny just stared at me with those cold blue eyes that reminded me exactly of his father's. Mom had spent all day cooking, pulling out her best china, arranging flowers she'd picked from the garden. She was trying so hard to make this feel like a real family gathering, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "So, Jake, your dad tells me you're on the football team," Mom said brightly, setting down a platter of roast beef that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "Not anymore," Jake replied, finally looking up from his phone. "Got kicked off for fighting." Frank's jaw tightened. "We're working through some behavioral issues." Behavioral issues. That was one way to put it. Jake spent the entire meal making snide comments under his breath, criticizing Mom's cooking and generally acting like a spoiled brat who'd never been told no in his life. Danny wasn't much better. When Mom asked about school, he just shrugged. When she tried to interest him in dessert, he said he didn't eat weird stuff, even though she'd made a perfectly normal apple pie. "They're still adjusting to the new family situation," Frank explained after Jake had gotten up mid-meal to use the bathroom and somehow forgotten to come back for 20 minutes. New family situation. I was still adjusting to it myself, and I was supposedly a mature adult. These kids clearly resented being forced into visits they didn't want, and Mom was trying so hard to win them over that it was painful to watch. Have you ever experienced that moment when you realize your family is about to get a lot more complicated? Drop a comment below and let me know how you handled blended family drama. After the boys left, Frank settled into Dad's old recliner like he'd been sitting there for years. "That went well," he said, reaching for the TV remote Jake had abandoned. Well? Jake had been openly rude, Danny had barely spoken, and Mom looked like she was about to cry from exhaustion. If that was Frank's idea of going well, I was seriously concerned about his judgment. "They're good kids," Mom said quickly, already starting to clear the table. "They just need time to warm up to us." Us. I noticed Frank wasn't helping with cleanup, just clicking through channels while Mom and I dealt with the mountain of dishes and leftover food that would take days to finish. "Mom, why don't you sit down?" I suggested. "You're 5 months pregnant. You shouldn't be on your feet all day. Your mother's stronger than she looks," Frank called from the living room. "She doesn't need babying." Actually, she did need someone looking out for her. That was supposed to be what husbands did, wasn't it? But Frank seemed more interested in making himself comfortable than making sure his pregnant wife wasn't overdoing it. I spent the rest of that winter break trying to find my place in this new family structure. Frank had opinions about everything: how Mom should cook, when she should go to bed, what TV shows they should watch. He wasn't abusive exactly, but there was something controlling about the way he operated, and he clearly didn't know what to make of me. I was an inconvenience, someone else's kid who happened to own the house he was living in. He never said that directly, but I could feel it in the way he looked at me, the way he talked around me rather than to me. "Christina's always been independent," Mom would say when I questioned some decision Frank had made about the house. "Haven't you, honey?" Independent. Her code for don't rock the boat. Mom was so happy, so grateful to have someone taking care of her, that she couldn't see how uncomfortable Frank made me. The pregnancy was progressing well, but Mom was tired all the time. Frank's solution was to have me take over more household responsibilities when I was home. Never mind that I was trying to study for spring semester exams. Never mind that it was my winter break, time I'd planned to spend relaxing. "Family pitches in," Frank said when I suggested maybe he could help with laundry occasionally. That's what family does. Family, right? Because family definitely meant the college student doing all the housework while the able-bodied adult man watched sports and complained about dinner being late. By the time I headed back to campus in January, I was actually relieved to leave. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like I was a guest in my own property, walking on eggshells to avoid disrupting the new dynamic Frank had established. "Drive safe," Mom called from the front porch, one hand on her growing belly. "Call when you get there." I would. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't counting down the days until I could come home again. Spring semester flew by in a blur of midterms, projects, and the growing realization that I was dreading spring break. For the first time in my college career, I actually considered staying on campus instead of going home. My roommate Sarah was from California, and she'd invited me to visit her family for the week. "Come on," she said as we studied for our marketing final. Beach, sunshine, no family drama. What's not to love? It was tempting. More tempting than it should have been. But Mom was due in 6 weeks, and I knew she'd be hurt if I didn't come home. Plus, I was genuinely excited about meeting my new sibling. It was the family dynamics I was dreading, not the baby. The house felt even more like Frank's territory when I arrived in March. He'd installed a new sound system in the living room, mounted a bigger TV, and somehow accumulated enough tools and equipment to turn the garage into his personal workshop. My dad's old workbench was buried under Frank's projects. "Honey, you're just in time," Mom said, waddling out to meet me. She was huge, moving slowly, and had that exhausted look pregnant women get in the final weeks. "How are you feeling?" I asked, giving her the gentlest hug I could manage. "Like I'm carrying a bowling ball," she laughed. "Or 2 bowling balls." Dr. Martinez confirmed twins at the last appointment. Twins. I was going to have 2 new siblings at once. The thought was overwhelming and exciting in equal measure. Frank appeared behind her, his hand immediately going to Mom's lower back in a gesture that seemed more possessive than supportive. "Boys," he announced with obvious pride. "Due the first week of April." Boys. Of course they were boys. Frank's genetic line would continue, while Dad's ended with me. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. "Do you have names picked out?" "Frank Jr. and Michael," Mom said quickly, before Frank could answer. "After Frank and my father." No mention of naming one after Dad. Not even a middle name to honor the man who'd built this house, who'd loved Mom for 15 years, who'd made sure I'd always have a home, but I swallowed that disappointment along with all the others. The week was a preview of what life would be like with 3 adults and 2 babies, in a house that had felt spacious when it was just Mom and me. Frank's boys visited twice, bringing their usual charm and gratitude. Jake had apparently been arrested for vandalism since Christmas, but was working on making better choices. Danny had started smoking and hiding it poorly, reeking of cigarettes whenever he came inside. "They're testing boundaries," Frank explained when Mom expressed concern about Danny's new habit. "It's normal teenage behavior. Normal for his family, maybe." I'd managed to get through high school without getting arrested or picking up addictive habits. But apparently Frank's parenting standards were more relaxed than what I'd grown up with. The babies arrived 3 days before spring break ended. I got the call at 2 a.m. from Frank, his voice tight with stress and something that might have been panic. "Your mother's in labor," he said without preamble. "It's early, but the doctor says everything should be fine." Should be fine. Those words echoed in my head during the 30-minute drive to the hospital. Mom was 41, having her first pregnancy in over 20 years, carrying twins who were arriving early. Should be fine felt like wishful thinking. But she was fine, tired, overwhelmed, but fine. And my baby brothers were perfect. Tiny, red-faced, screaming bundles of energy who looked nothing like me but everything like Frank. Frank Jr. weighed 5 pounds, 3 ounces. Michael was 4 pounds, 15 ounces. Both healthy enough to go home after 3 days in the hospital, though they'd need careful monitoring for the first few weeks. "They're beautiful," I whispered, holding Frank Jr. while Mom fed Michael. And they were. Despite everything complicated about this family situation, these babies were innocent and perfect, and mine to love. "You're such a natural," Mom said, watching me rock the tiny bundle in my arms. "You're going to be the best big sister." I wanted to be. Despite my complicated feelings about Frank, despite feeling displaced in my own house, I wanted to be the sister these boys deserved. The reality of life with newborn twins hit fast and hard. Mom was exhausted, trying to breastfeed 2 hungry babies while recovering from a difficult delivery. Frank was helpful in his own way, but his idea of helping involved a lot of directing Mom to do things differently, rather than actually doing things himself. "You need to get them on a schedule," he'd say when both babies were crying at 3 a.m. "My first wife never had this much trouble." His first wife. Another person I'd never heard about until she became a point of comparison. Apparently, Frank's expertise in child rearing came from raising Jake and Danny, which explained a lot about how those boys had turned out. I cut spring break short and headed back to campus 3 days early. I felt guilty leaving Mom with 2 newborns and Frank's questionable support system, but I had classes to attend and a life to get back to. "Call me if you need anything," I told Mom as I kissed her goodbye. "We'll be fine," Frank answered before Mom could respond. "We've got everything under control here." Control. That seemed to be Frank's favorite word. He controlled the TV remote, the household decisions, even the conversations. And increasingly, it felt like he was trying to control how much space I was allowed to take up in my own house. The drive back to campus felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a week. I loved my new brothers. I loved my mother, but I was beginning to realize that loving them and being comfortable in their presence were 2 very different things. The next 2 years passed in a blur of avoiding home as much as possible while trying not to feel guilty about it. I threw myself into college life, taking summer classes to graduate early, working internships that kept me busy during breaks, and generally finding excuses to stay away from the increasingly crowded house that legally belonged to me but felt less like home every time I visited. When I did go back, usually for major holidays or the twins' birthdays, the changes were always jarring. Frank had remodeled the kitchen without asking my opinion, installing ugly granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that looked expensive but cheap at the same time. He'd converted Dad's old office into a nursery, painting over the wood paneling Dad had installed himself and removing the built-in shelves where he'd kept his construction manuals and family photos. "Looks more modern now," Frank said when I stared at the transformed room during Thanksgiving of my senior year. Modern. Everything Frank touched became modern, which seemed to be his code for erasing any trace of the family who'd lived there before him. The twins were adorable. I'll give them that. Frank Jr. was crawling everywhere, getting into everything, with Mom's dark eyes and Frank's stubborn chin. Michael was quieter, more observant, but had this smile that could melt your heart. When I held them, read to them, played peekaboo in the living room, I remembered why I'd been excited about being a big sister. But watching Frank parent them was like watching a masterclass in how to raise entitled kids. Everything they wanted, they got. When Frank Jr. threw food on the floor, Frank thought it was funny. When Michael cried because he couldn't reach a toy, Frank immediately got it for him instead of encouraging him to problem solve. "They're just babies," Mom would say when I suggested maybe some gentle boundaries might be helpful. "They have their whole lives to learn rules." Rules. Frank's boys, Jake and Danny, were living proof of what happened when kids didn't learn rules early. Jake was now 18 and had dropped out of high school, spending his days playing video games in his mother's basement and occasionally showing up to ask Frank for money. Danny was 15 and already had a juvenile record that Frank blamed on bad influences rather than lack of supervision. But it wasn't my job to criticize Frank's parenting. It wasn't my house anymore, even though my name was still on the deed. It was their family, their rules, their chaos to navigate. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and immediately landed a job with a marketing firm 2 states away. Far enough to have my own life, close enough to visit when necessary. The salary wasn't huge, but it was mine, earned by my own efforts, dependent on no one else's generosity or mood. "I'm so proud of you," Mom said when I called to tell her about the job offer. "Your father would have been so proud too, Dad." She rarely mentioned him anymore, and when she did, it was always in the past tense, like he was ancient history rather than the man who'd shaped the first 18 years of my life. "Thanks, Mom," I said. "I'll be able to visit more often once I get settled." That was a lie, but it made her happy. Truth was, I was already planning to visit less often. Each trip home reminded me more clearly that I didn't belong in the family Frank was building. I was a leftover piece from Mom's previous life, tolerated, but not truly welcomed. My apartment was small, but entirely mine. No one else's furniture, no one else's rules, no unexpected changes when I came home from work. I could eat cereal for dinner if I wanted, watch whatever was on TV, leave dishes in the sink overnight without someone passive-aggressively commenting on my housekeeping. For the first time since Frank entered our lives, I felt like I could breathe. The twins' second birthday was the first family event I missed. I had a legitimate work commitment, a client presentation that couldn't be rescheduled, but part of me was relieved to have an excuse. "The boys kept asking where Sissy was," Mom said when she called that evening. "I felt so bad telling them you couldn't be there. Sissy." They'd started calling me that when they learned to talk, and it never failed to melt my heart. Whatever complicated feelings I had about their father, I genuinely loved those little boys. "I'll make it up to them," I promised. "Maybe I can take them to the zoo next time I visit." "That would be wonderful," Mom said, her voice brightening. "Frank's been so busy with work lately, and Jake's been, well, you know how teenagers are." Jake was 20 now, hardly a teenager. But Mom had adopted Frank's habit of making excuses for his boy's behavior. Apparently, Jake had moved back in with Frank and Mom after his latest girlfriend kicked him out for not paying rent. So now the house that had once sheltered 3 people was home to 6, with all the chaos and stress that entailed. I should have felt guilty about staying away. I should have been there helping Mom navigate the complicated dynamics of this blended family. But honestly, I felt like I'd put in my time trying to make Frank's vision of family work. Now it was time to build a life that actually belonged to me. Christmas was coming up, and for the first time in my life, I was dreading it. Mom had called 3 times in the past week, her voice getting more strained each time, talking about all the preparations she was making for the big family Christmas Frank wanted. Jake would be there, presumably bringing whatever drama was currently defining his life. Danny was bringing his new girlfriend, who Frank had already decided he didn't like. Frank's ex-wife might even stop by to pick up presents for the boys, adding another layer of tension to an already complicated day. "It's going to be so wonderful having everyone together," Mom said during our last conversation, but she sounded tired, overwhelmed, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Everyone. I wondered if that included me, or if I was just another obligation on Mom's growing list of people to please. I guess I'd find out soon enough. The Christmas from hell started badly and got worse from there. I should have trusted my instincts and stayed home with a good book and Chinese takeout, but guilt is a powerful motivator, and Mom's increasingly desperate phone calls had worn down my resistance. I arrived Christmas Eve to find the house in chaos. Jake had moved back into my old bedroom without asking permission, his dirty clothes covering every surface and the smell of stale beer permanently embedded in the carpet. Danny and his girlfriend Brittany had claimed the living room couch as their personal makeout zone, complete with blankets and pillows that suggested they'd been sleeping there. "Christina!" Mom rushed to hug me, her smile bright, but her eyes tired. "I'm so glad you made it. Frank's been cooking all morning." Frank doesn't cook. At least he'd never cooked in all the years I'd known him, but apparently Christmas was the exception, and he'd taken over the kitchen like a general commanding troops, barking orders at Mom about side dishes and timing, while burning what smelled like a very expensive ham. "Where should I put my bags?" I asked, looking around at the chaos. "Oh," Mom's face fell slightly. "Well, Jake's in your room right now, but we set up an air mattress in the twins' room. I hope that's okay?" The twins' room. I was being relegated to sleeping on the floor with my 3-year-old brothers while Jake sprawled across my childhood bedroom like he owned the place. "That's fine," I lied, because Mom looked like she was about to cry and Frank was already shooting me looks that suggested I better not cause problems. Frank Jr. and Michael were adorable, running around in matching Christmas pajamas, high on excitement and probably too much sugar. They launched themselves at my legs the moment they saw me, chattering about Santa and presents and all the wonderful chaos of Christmas morning through toddler eyes. "Sissy, Sissy, look what we made!" Michael grabbed my hand and dragged me to the kitchen table where 2 paper snowflakes hung proudly next to a dozen others clearly made by more skilled hands. "Beautiful," I said, and meant it. "Did you make these all by yourself?" "Mommy helped," Frank Jr. admitted with the brutal honesty of 3-year-old. "But we picked the colors. Red and green, naturally." Everything in the house had been decorated in traditional Christmas colors, from the tree to the mantel to the paper chains draped over doorways. It looked like Christmas had exploded everywhere, but there was something frantic about it, like Mom was trying to create magic through sheer force of will. Dinner was a disaster. Frank's ham was so overcooked it resembled leather, but nobody dared mention it. Jake showed up late and drunk, immediately starting an argument with Danny about borrowing money. Brittany spent the entire meal taking selfies and complaining about the food being too fancy. "This is nice," Frank said, carving the ruined ham with determination. "Having the whole family together." The whole family. I looked around the table at this collection of people who barely tolerated each other and wondered when exactly I'd become an outsider in my own house. Mom was trying so hard to make everything perfect, jumping up every 5 minutes to refill water glasses or fetch forgotten items from the kitchen. She looked exhausted, running on stress and caffeine, but Frank just sat there like a king holding court while she waited on everyone. "Mom, sit down," I said finally. "I'll get the dessert." "Your mother's got it handled," Frank replied before Mom could answer. "She likes taking care of her family." Her family, not our family. Her family. And apparently I was somewhere on the periphery of that definition. After dinner, we moved to the living room for the traditional Christmas Eve gift exchange. The twins got exactly what they'd asked for, plus several items they hadn't known they wanted. Jake received an envelope that probably contained money, judging by his suddenly improved mood. Danny got a new phone. Brittany got some jewelry that made her squeal with delight. When Frank handed me a small wrapped box, I felt a flutter of hope that maybe I'd misjudged his feelings toward me. Maybe this was his attempt at building bridges. Inside was a gas station gift card for $25. $25. For comparison, Jake's envelope had contained what looked like several $100 bills, and Danny's phone had probably cost more than my monthly rent. "For when you're driving back and forth to work," Frank said with what he probably thought was a thoughtful smile. Mom beamed like he'd given me diamonds. Frank is so practical. He thinks of everything. Everything except the fact that a gas card worth less than what most people spend on lunch felt like a slap in the face when everyone else had received gifts that actually required thought and consideration. "Thank you," I managed, because what else could I say with Mom watching hopefully and the twins playing with their new toys, and the whole room pretending this was normal family behavior. But something inside me cracked that night. Lying on an air mattress in my baby brother's room, listening to Jake's music thumping through the walls of my former bedroom while Frank and Mom argued in whispers about money in their room down the hall. This wasn't my family anymore. I was a guest they tolerated, a leftover piece from Mom's previous life that Frank was slowly but surely erasing from the picture. Christmas morning would prove me right in ways I never could have imagined. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes your breath visible indoors, which seemed fitting for what was about to become the most humiliating day of my life. The twins woke up at dawn, as toddlers do on Christmas, bouncing on my air mattress with the enthusiasm that only comes from believing in Santa Claus and the magic of presents under the tree. Their excitement was infectious, and for a moment I forgot about gas station gift cards and sleeping on the floor and feeling like an unwanted guest in my own house. "Sissy, come see! Santa came!" Frank Jr. grabbed my hand with sticky fingers, dragging me toward the living room where a mountain of wrapped packages awaited under Frank's oversized tree. The scene was chaotic and joyful in the way Christmas mornings should be. Mom was making coffee in her bathrobe. Jake had actually emerged from my bedroom before noon, and even Danny seemed less sullen than usual. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe this day would be different. Frank emerged from the master bedroom wearing a red sweater that made him look like an oversized Christmas elf, already taking charge of present distribution like he was conducting an orchestra. "All right, everyone, let's do this right," he announced, settling into Dad's old recliner with a cup of coffee. Kids first, then adults. The twins tore through their presents with the pure joy that makes Christmas mornings magical. Remote control cars, building blocks, picture books, more toys than 2 3-year-olds could possibly need. Mom documented everything with her phone, her face glowing with happiness as she watched her babies discover each new treasure. Jake got his envelope again, this one apparently containing even more cash than yesterday's offering, plus a new gaming system that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. Danny received a leather jacket that made him look 20 instead of 16, and Brittany got perfume that she immediately sprayed all over herself until the room reeked of artificial flowers. "Christina," Frank called, and I felt that familiar flutter of hope. Maybe he'd gotten me a real gift this time. Maybe yesterday's gas card had been a joke, or a mistake, or just the first part of something bigger. Frank handed me a small wrapped package with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hope you can use this." Inside was a coffee mug with "World's Okayest Daughter" printed in fading letters, the kind of thing you'd find in a clearance bin at a discount store. The room went silent. Even Jake looked uncomfortable. "It's funny," Frank said with forced cheer. Apparently the only person who didn't understand why everyone had stopped talking. World's okayest daughter. Not even world's best sister for the twins I adored, or world's greatest daughter, like the countless mugs Mom used to get for Mother's Day when I was little. Just okayest. Frank. Mom started quietly, her voice carrying a warning I'd rarely heard her use with him. "What?" "It's a joke," he said, looking genuinely confused by our reaction. "She's always so serious about everything. Always so serious." Right. Because expecting to be treated with basic respect in my own house was being too serious. But the real blow came that evening, during what was supposed to be our traditional Christmas dinner with Frank's extended family. His brother and sister-in-law had driven in from the next county, bringing their own teenage kids who immediately made themselves at home by eating all the good snacks and leaving their trash everywhere. We'd just sat down to dinner when Frank stood up, raising his beer bottle like he was about to make a toast. "I want to say something," he announced, his voice carrying that slightly slurred quality that meant he'd been drinking steadily since breakfast. "This year has been incredible. New wife, beautiful sons, everything a man could want." He gestured around the table with obvious pride. Looking at this table, seeing my real family all together, it just makes a man grateful for what he's built. His real family. The words hit me like a physical blow. Frank's gaze landed on me, and his expression hardened slightly. "Of course, we've got some people here who aren't really part of the family. People who just happened to come with the house." The room went dead silent. Even the twins stopped chattering. "Christina," Frank continued, his voice taking on that fake friendly tone that made my skin crawl, "you can eat in the living room if you want. We need this table for family members." I stared at him in shock, waiting for someone to object, for Mom to defend me, for anyone to point out how completely inappropriate this was. Mom looked down at her plate, her face flushed with embarrassment, but her mouth firmly closed. "Real family shares blood," Frank continued, apparently enjoying the attention. "And since you're not getting any Christmas presents anyway, you might as well eat somewhere else." Not getting Christmas presents. He was announcing to his entire extended family that I, the person whose house they were eating in, wasn't worthy of basic holiday consideration. The humiliation burned through my chest like acid. 24 years old, college graduate, homeowner, and I was being dismissed like a stray dog who'd wandered into the wrong yard. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. "You know what, Frank? You're absolutely right." His smug expression faltered slightly at my calm tone. "I'm not part of your family. And you know what else? This isn't your house." The silence in the room was deafening. "Christina?" Mom whispered, finally looking up from her plate. "No, Mom," I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. "I'm done pretending this is normal. I'm done being treated like garbage in my own house. I'm done watching you make excuses for this man's cruelty." Frank's face was turning red. "Now you listen here. I'm leaving," I announced to the room. "But don't worry. This problem is about to solve itself permanently." I grabbed my coat and purse, ignoring Mom's protests and Frank's angry sputtering. The twins started crying, sensing the tension, but not understanding what was happening. As I reached the front door, I turned back one last time. "Merry Christmas, everyone. Enjoy the house while you can." What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments below and make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss how this story ends. The drive to my apartment was a blur of angry tears and racing thoughts. By the time I reached my building, I knew exactly what I had to do. Some people might call it cruel. I called it justice. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. David Chen, my old college study partner who'd gone to law school and now practiced family law in our hometown. "David?" I said when he answered on the third ring. "It's Christina Walsh. I know it's Christmas, but I need a favor. How fast can you draw up eviction papers?" "Eviction papers?" David's voice was careful, professional, even though I'd probably interrupted his own Christmas celebration. "Christina, what's going on?" I gave him the abbreviated version, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained about Frank, the house ownership, and tonight's spectacular humiliation. David listened without interrupting, occasionally making those small noises lawyers make when they're mentally calculating legal strategies. "The house is definitely in your name?" he asked when I finished. "Has been since I was 15. Dad transferred the deed during the divorce, and I inherited it when he died. I have all the paperwork." "And your mother and her husband have been living there without any formal rental agreement?" "Frank moved in when they got married. Mom's been there the whole time, but legally she's been my tenant since Dad died, even though we never formalized it." David was quiet for a moment, and I could hear voices in the background. His own family, probably wondering why he was taking a work call on Christmas. "Christina, I have to ask. Are you sure you want to do this? Evicting your mother and her family? It's going to be permanent. There's no taking this back once we start the process." Was I sure? I thought about Frank's smug face as he dismissed me from my own dinner table. I thought about Mom's silence, her refusal to defend me even when her husband was actively humiliating me. I thought about sleeping on an air mattress while Jake sprawled across my childhood bedroom like he owned it. "I'm sure," I said. "They made it very clear tonight that I'm not part of their family. Well, they can build their family somewhere else." "Okay," David said, his voice shifting into lawyer mode. "In this state, we need to provide 60 days notice for family members, even without a lease agreement. I can have the papers drawn up tonight and served first thing tomorrow morning if you want to move fast. 60 days. 2 months for them to find somewhere else to live." It seemed generous considering they'd just spent Christmas dinner telling me I didn't belong in my own house. "Do it," I said. "And David, can you make sure the sheriff serves them personally? I want Frank to understand this is real. Consider it done. I'll email you the paperwork tonight for your review, and we'll have a deputy at their door by 9 a.m. tomorrow." Their door. It felt strange calling it their door when it had been mine for 9 years. After we hung up, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by my own furniture and my own choices, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete control over my own life. My phone started ringing almost immediately. Mom, probably. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her tearful message about how Frank had been drinking, how he didn't mean what he said, how we could work this out if I just came back. Too little, too late. Frank had meant every word, and we all knew it. The phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize, probably Frank calling from someone else's phone. I declined the call and turned off my phone completely. Whatever they had to say, I didn't want to hear it. They'd made their position clear at dinner. Now I was making mine clear in return. David's email arrived at 11 p.m. with a PDF attachment labeled, "Notice to quit." Legal language dressed up what amounted to a simple message. "You have 60 days to get out of my house." Reading through the formal language gave me a sense of satisfaction I probably should have felt guilty about. But I didn't. For the first time since Frank entered our lives, I was the one making decisions about my own property. I approved the paperwork with a quick email back to David, then poured myself a glass of wine and settled in to wait for morning. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting. The irony wasn't lost on me. Frank had spent Christmas dinner talking about real family and blood relations. Well, my blood had paid for that house. My father's blood, sweat, and years of construction work. My inheritance, carefully protected in legal documents that Frank had apparently never bothered to research. He'd underestimated me completely. Treated me like I was powerless, like I'd just accept whatever scraps of respect he felt like throwing my way. Big mistake. I slept better that night than I had in months. For the first time since Frank became part of our lives, I was looking forward to tomorrow. My phone was still off when I woke up, but I could imagine the chaos that was probably erupting 20 miles away, as a sheriff's deputy knocked on the door of my childhood home with official papers that would change everything. Part of me felt bad for the twins. They were innocent in all this, just little boys who'd gotten caught up in their father's power games. But they'd be fine. Kids are resilient, and maybe growing up somewhere else would actually be better for them. The rest of the family? They'd made their choice when they decided I wasn't worth basic human decency. Now they could live with the consequences. I made coffee, checked my email for any updates from David, and wondered how long it would take for them to realize I wasn't bluffing. Something told me I wouldn't have to wait long to find out. The pounding on my apartment door started at 7:43 a.m., aggressive and desperate in a way that could only mean one thing. The eviction notice had been served. I opened the door to find Mom standing in my hallway, still in her pajamas with a winter coat thrown over them, her hair uncombed and her eyes red from crying. Behind her stood Frank, his face purple with rage and a crumpled piece of legal paper clutched in his fist. "Christina, what have you done?" Mom's voice was barely a whisper. "Good morning to you too," I said calmly, though my heart was racing. Seeing them both on my doorstep, Frank looking like he might actually explode, was more intimidating than I'd expected. "You can't do this," Frank snarled, shoving past Mom to get closer to my door. "That house has been our home for 4 years. My boys live there. You can't just throw us out." "Actually, I can," I replied, keeping my voice level. "It's my house, Frank. It's been my house since I was 15 years old. You've been living there as my guest, and now you're not welcome anymore." "Guest?" His voice cracked with indignation. "I'm married to your mother. I've been paying the utilities, the maintenance, the property taxes. Have you been paying me rent?" I interrupted. "Because last time I checked, you've been living rent-free in my property for 4 years while I've been paying rent somewhere else." Mom stepped between us, her hands shaking. "Honey, please. We can work this out. Frank was drunk last night. He didn't mean those things he said." "Yes, he did," I said quietly. "He's been meaning them for 4 years, Mom. He just finally said them out loud." Frank's face was getting redder by the second. "You spoiled little brat. We took care of that house. We improved it. We made it a home. You remodeled my house without my permission," I corrected. "You moved your son into my bedroom without asking. You've treated me like an intruder in my own property since the day you moved in." "Christina, please." Mom was crying now, real tears streaming down her face. "The twins? They're just babies. Where are we supposed to go?" The twins. My heart clenched at the thought of Frank Jr. and Michael, probably confused and scared by all the chaos they didn't understand, but I forced myself to stay strong. "You have 60 days to figure it out," I said. "That's more than generous." "Generous?" Frank exploded. "You're throwing your pregnant mother out of her home right after Christmas." "Pregnant?" I stared at Mom in shock. "You're pregnant again?" Mom's hand went to her still flat stomach, and she nodded miserably. 2 months. We weren't going to tell anyone yet, but pregnant. At 41, with 3-year-old twins and a family in chaos. The timing couldn't have been worse. For a moment, I wavered. The image of Mom, pregnant and homeless because of my decision, made my stomach twist with guilt. But then I remembered Frank's words from last night. "Real family shares blood. You're not getting presents anyway. Eat in the living room with the rest of the people who don't belong." "You should have thought about that before you decided I wasn't part of the family," I said, my resolve hardening again. Frank stepped closer, his bulk intimidating in the narrow hallway. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Well, let me tell you something, college girl. We've been living in that house for 4 years. We have tenant rights. You can't just kick us out because you're having a tantrum." "It's not a tantrum, Frank. It's a business decision. And I already checked with my lawyer. You never signed a lease, never paid rent, never established any formal tenancy agreement. Legally, you're just guests who've overstayed their welcome." The truth hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak again. "That house is worth more now because of the work I put into it," he said desperately. "I installed new appliances, redid the kitchen, painted everything. Improvements I never authorized," I pointed out. "And if you'd bothered to ask permission before making those changes, you'd have learned that any improvements to my property belong to me." Mom was sobbing openly now. "Christina, please. I know Frank said some horrible things, but he's sorry. Aren't you, Frank?" Frank's jaw worked silently. Even now, facing eviction from the house he'd treated as his own, he couldn't bring himself to apologize to me. "You've got 60 days, I repeated, stepping back toward my apartment. "I'd suggest you start looking for somewhere else to live." "This isn't over," Frank said, his voice low and threatening. "You'll regret this." "The only thing I regret," I said, "is waiting this long to stand up for myself." I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to Mom's sobs and Frank's angry muttering as they finally walked away. My hands were shaking, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for most of the conversation. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Papers served at 8:15 a.m. Deputy said the respondents became very agitated. Everything okay? Perfect, I texted back. They just left my apartment. Frank's threatening me, but Mom's trying to negotiate. Document everything. Save voicemails, screenshot texts. If he escalates, we can get a restraining order. Smart advice. I had a feeling this was just the beginning. Over the next hour, my phone rang constantly. Mom, Frank, even Jake calling to tell me what a horrible person I was for destroying the family. I let them all go to voicemail, saving each message as David had suggested. The voicemails ranged from Mom's tearful pleas to Frank's increasingly angry threats. Jake's message was particularly charming, calling me a selfish witch and promising I'd pay for this. By noon, the calls had stopped. I imagined them huddled around the kitchen table in my house trying to figure out their next move, maybe calling lawyers of their own, maybe looking at rental listings online, maybe just sitting in stunned silence as the reality of their situation sank in. Part of me felt guilty. The rational part of my brain knew I was displacing a pregnant woman and 2 toddlers right after Christmas. But the larger part of me felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of finally fighting back. Frank had spent 4 years making me feel unwelcome in my own house. He'd dismissed me, belittled me, and finally humiliated me in front of his entire family. Now he could see how it felt to be the one without a place to belong. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in emotional manipulation, and I had to admit, Mom was surprisingly good at it when she put her mind to it. It started with the guilt trip phone calls. Daily conversations where she'd update me on how the twins were asking where Sissy was, how Frank Jr. kept looking for me at bedtime story time, how Michael had drawn me a picture with crayons and asked when I was coming home. "They don't understand why you're not here," she'd say, her voice heavy with the kind of sadness that was designed to make me feel like a monster. Frank Jr. asked if you don't love them anymore. Low blow, Mom. Using my baby brother's confusion to make me feel guilty was a new level of manipulation, even for her. Then came the practical appeals. The house was too expensive for them to maintain on their own. Frank's construction work was seasonal, and winter was always slow. With another baby coming and the twins to think about, how could they possibly afford first month's rent and a security deposit somewhere else? "We've put so much work into that house," she'd say during these calls. "It feels like our home now. Surely we can work out some kind of arrangement." Arrangement? Right. Like the arrangement where I'd spent 4 years feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own property, while Frank treated it like his personal kingdom. The most creative attempt came in week 2, when Mom showed up at my office with the twins in tow. Frank Jr. and Michael in their little winter coats, holding hands and looking absolutely adorable, as Mom led them through the lobby toward my desk. "Surprise!" Mom called out brightly, like this was a fun family visit and not an obvious attempt to manipulate me in front of my coworkers. The twins launched themselves at me with the enthusiasm they'd always shown, and my heart clenched as I hugged their small bodies and smelled that familiar baby shampoo scent in their hair. "Sissy," Michael said loudly enough for half the office to hear, "Mommy says you're mad at us." Perfect. Now my colleagues were witnessing what looked like me refusing to forgive adorable 3-year-olds for some imaginary slight. "I'm not mad at you," I said quietly, kneeling down to their level. "I love you both very much." "Then why can't you come home?" Frank Jr. asked with the devastating logic of a toddler. "Daddy says you don't want to live with us anymore," Daddy says. Of course, Frank had coached them on exactly what to say to maximum guilt-inducing effect. Mom was watching this interaction with satisfaction, clearly pleased with how her ambush was playing out. Around us, my coworkers were pretending to work while obviously listening to every word. "Sometimes grown-ups have to live in different places," I said carefully, "but that doesn't mean I don't love you." "But we miss you," Michael said, his little lower lip starting to tremble. "And Mommy cries all the time now." I looked up at Mom, who had the grace to look slightly ashamed of using her pregnancy hormones as part of her manipulation campaign. "Boys," I said gently, "why don't you color me some pictures while I talk to Mommy?" I handed them paper and crayons from my desk drawer, then guided Mom to the small conference room where we could have some privacy. "This is low, even for you," I said once the door closed. "They wanted to see you," Mom said defensively. "I can't explain to 3-year-olds why their sister suddenly disappeared from their lives." "I didn't disappear. You decided I wasn't part of the family, remember? Frank made that very clear at Christmas dinner." Mom's face crumpled. "He was drunk, Christina. He says stupid things when he drinks. You know that. What I know is that drunk people tell the truth. Frank has been thinking those things for years. He just finally said them out loud. He's willing to apologize," she said quickly. "He knows he was wrong. We both do." "Is he?" Because he couldn't manage to apologize when he was standing in my hallway threatening me. Mom looked down at her hands. He's proud. You know how men are. How men are. Right. Because pride was an acceptable excuse for treating people like garbage. Mom, I'm not changing my mind, I said as gently as I could. You have 6 more weeks to find somewhere else to live. That's plenty of time. We can't afford anywhere else, she whispered. Not with another baby coming, not with Frank's work being so irregular. And the twins are settled in daycare. They have friends in the neighborhood. Then maybe Frank should have thought about that before he decided to humiliate me in front of his entire family. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the twins chattering happily in the outer office, probably entertaining my coworkers with their adorable antics. I never wanted this, Mom said finally. I never wanted you to feel unwelcome, but you allowed it, I replied. For 4 years, you watched him treat me like I didn't belong, and you never said a word. Even at Christmas, when he was actively humiliating me, you stayed silent. I was trying to keep the peace, she said weakly. Whose peace, Mom? Because it sure wasn't mine. When we emerged from the conference room, I found the twins had indeed charmed my entire department. My boss was showing them pictures of his own grandchildren, and the administrative assistant had given them cookies from her desk drawer. Mommy, look! Frank Jr. ran over with a drawing he'd made. I drew Sissy's office. It was actually a pretty good representation of my cubicle, complete with stick figure me sitting at a computer and what might have been a telephone. It's beautiful, I said, genuinely touched. Can I keep it? He nodded enthusiastically, and Michael shyly offered his own artwork, a colorful scribble that he announced was Sissy's car. Thank you both, I said, hugging them again. I love them so much. As Mom gathered their coats and prepared to leave, Frank Jr. looked up at me with those serious dark eyes that reminded me so much of Dad. Sissy, are you really not coming home? The question hung in the air while my coworkers pretended not to listen, and Mom held her breath waiting for my answer. I'll always be your sister, I said finally, but I have my own home now. It was the best truth I could offer a 3-year-old who didn't understand why the adults in his life had made everything so complicated. After they left, I sat at my desk staring at the twins' drawings, feeling the familiar mix of love and guilt and anger that had defined my relationship with my family for the past 4 years. But beneath all that, stronger than all that, was the certainty that I was doing the right thing. Frank had drawn the battle lines on Christmas night. Now he could deal with the consequences. 3 weeks into the 60-day notice period, David called with news that changed everything. You're not going to believe what my investigator found, he said, his voice carrying that particular satisfaction lawyers get when they uncover something good. Investigator? I'd been expecting Frank to challenge the eviction legally, but I hadn't realized David was conducting his own research. Just a routine background check to make sure we weren't missing any legal complications. Turns out your stepfather has been busier than anyone realized. I settled into my desk chair, phone pressed to my ear. What did you find? Frank Morrison has owned a rental property across town for the past 6 years, a 3-bedroom house on Maple Street that he's been renting out for $1,200 a month. The words hit me like a physical blow. He owns another house. Bought it 2 years before he married your mother. Been collecting rental income the entire time he's been living rent-free in your property. I sat there absorbing this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Frank's mysterious work trips that sometimes lasted several days. His secretive phone calls about property maintenance. The way he always seemed to have more cash than his construction work should have provided. So he's had somewhere else to live this entire time, I said slowly. Not just somewhere else. Somewhere that's been generating income while he's been playing house in your property. According to the rental records, his current tenant's lease expires next month. Next month. Right around the time his eviction notice would take effect. David, you're telling me that Frank has been collecting rent from his own house while living for free in mine? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And here's the kicker. When I checked the property records, guess who's listed as the backup contact on his rental lease? I already knew before he said it. His ex-wife. Bingo. Looks like Frank Jr. and Danny's mother has been helping manage the rental property, which means Frank's family has known all along that he had an exit strategy. The betrayal was breathtaking in its scope. Not just Frank's deception, but the realization that his entire family had been complicit in treating me like a charity case, while he profited from property ownership himself. There's more, David continued. I pulled the financial records for his rental income. Frank's been making nearly $15,000 a year from that property. Tax-free money, since he's been claiming your house as his primary residence and avoiding capital gains on the rental. $15,000 a year, while crying poverty every time Mom asked him to contribute more to household expenses. While complaining about money being tight when it came time for my Christmas presents, while lecturing me about family responsibility and pitching in during hard times. "What does this mean legally?" I asked. "It means Frank has demonstrated clear ability to house his family elsewhere and has been defrauding the IRS by claiming homestead exemption on property he doesn't own. It also means if he challenges the eviction, we can prove he's been living there in bad faith from the beginning." Bad faith. That was one way to put it. "David, I want to accelerate the timeline. If he has somewhere else to go, they don't need 60 days. I can file for immediate possession based on the fraud evidence, but are you sure you want to push that hard? It's going to make the family situation even more explosive." The family situation, right. Because I should continue prioritizing Frank's comfort over my own property rights. "Do it," I said. "If he's been lying about this for 4 years, I'm done accommodating his dishonesty." 3 days later, I got the call I'd been both expecting and dreading. "They're gone," David said simply. "Gone? Moved out sometime yesterday. Your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, called this morning to report a moving truck in the driveway. Frank returned the keys to my office an hour ago." Gone. After all the tears and manipulation and threats, they'd simply left. "Did he say anything when he returned the keys?" "Just that you'd be hearing from his lawyer about damages to the property. Pretty standard threat from someone who doesn't actually have grounds to sue." I was quiet for a moment, processing the strange mix of relief and sadness that came with getting what I'd wanted. "Christina, you still there?" "Yeah, I'm here. It's just, I expected more fight from him. Men like Frank are bullies," David said gently. "They fold fast when someone calls their bluff." He knew he couldn't win a legal challenge, especially once we uncovered the rental property. After we hung up, I sat in my office staring out the window, trying to figure out how I felt about this development. Part of me was relieved that the drama was over. Part of me was hurt that Mom had left without even saying goodbye. But mostly, I was curious about what condition they'd left my house in. That evening, I drove the familiar route home for the first time in 3 weeks. The house looked different somehow, smaller and emptier than I remembered. Frank's oversized truck was gone from the driveway, along with Mom's minivan and all the children's toys that had usually been scattered across the front yard. I used my key to let myself in and was surprised by what I found. They'd cleaned. Not just picked up their belongings, but actually cleaned. The floors were mopped, the windows sparkled, and there wasn't a single piece of garbage or forgotten belonging anywhere. In the kitchen, I found a note written in Mom's careful handwriting. "Christina, we're sorry it came to this. The house is yours as it should have been all along. We hope someday you can forgive us. The twins will miss their sissy. Mom." No mention of Frank, no forwarding address. Just a simple acknowledgement and an apology that probably should have come years earlier. I walked through the room slowly, seeing my childhood home with fresh eyes. The changes Frank had made were everywhere. His ugly granite countertops, his modern paint colors, his big screen TV still mounted on the wall he'd never asked permission to modify. But underneath all his improvements, the bones of the house were still the same, still the home Dad had built for our family, still the place where I'd grown up feeling safe and loved and wanted. It was mine again, completely, legally, undeniably mine. And for the first time in 4 years, that felt like enough. Standing in my empty house, surrounded by evidence of Frank's 4-year occupation, I made a decision that felt like stepping into a new version of myself. I was going to make this place mine again. Not just legally, but actually mine in every way that mattered. The next morning, I called my boss and requested a meeting about remote work options. Our company had been moving toward more flexible arrangements anyway, and my track record was strong enough that they agreed to let me work from home 3 days a week. The reduced commute time would give me the freedom to tackle the renovation project I was already planning in my head. Then I called the inheritance fund where Dad's remaining money had been sitting untouched for years. $28,000, plus interest. More than enough to undo Frank's improvements and create something that actually reflected my taste instead of his. The first thing to go was the granite countertops. I'd always hated them, and now I understood why. They were expensive looking but cheap underneath, the kind of flashy upgrade that impressed people who didn't know the difference between quality and status. I hired a local contractor, a woman named Beth who came highly recommended and understood exactly what I wanted when I said, "I need to erase the last 4 years and start over." "Ah," she said, nodding knowingly. "Reclaiming your space from someone else's vision. I've done this before. It's more common than you'd think." We designed a plan to restore the kitchen's original character while adding modern functionality. Butcher block counters that would age gracefully, white subway tiles that would never go out of style, and open shelving to replace the oversized cabinets Frank had installed. "Your father did beautiful work," Beth said, running her hand along the original crown molding Frank had covered with his modern trim. "We can bring all this craftsmanship back. Dad's craftsmanship." I'd forgotten how much care he'd put into every detail of this house, how every room reflected his attention to quality over flash. The renovation took 6 weeks, and I threw myself into it with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. I painted walls in colors I actually liked, soft blues and warm grays that made the rooms feel calm instead of ostentatious. I stripped Frank's modern paint off the built-in bookshelves Dad had made by hand, revealing the gorgeous natural wood underneath. In what used to be the twins' nursery, I created a home office with windows overlooking the backyard garden Mom had always talked about planting but never gotten around to. Beth helped me install French doors that opened onto a small patio, creating a workspace that felt connected to the outdoors. "This is going to be beautiful," she said as we reviewed the plans. "You can tell this house was loved once. It just needed someone to remember how to love it properly." The most satisfying moment came when I ripped up the cheap laminate flooring Frank had installed over Dad's original hardwood. The floors were scratched and needed refinishing, but the wood underneath was solid oak, rich and warm when properly cared for. "Why would anyone cover this up?" Beth asked, shaking her head as we surveyed the hidden treasure. "Because he didn't understand the value of what was already here," I said. It was becoming a theme of the renovation, discovering all the beautiful original features Frank had covered or removed in his rush to make everything modern. As the house transformed, so did my relationship with it. For the first time since Frank moved in, I felt like I was coming home when I walked through the front door. The space welcomed me instead of tolerating my presence. I bought my first new car with part of the inheritance money, trading in the old sedan I'd been driving since college for a reliable SUV that would handle the commute to the office on the days I still went in. Nothing fancy, but mine from the first payment to the last. The garden became my evening project. I planted herbs in raised beds Beth had built along the south side of the house, creating a little kitchen garden with basil, rosemary, and thyme. In the front yard, I replaced Frank's aggressive landscape lighting with subtle path lights that made the house look welcoming instead of commercial. "You've got good instincts," Beth said as we installed the last light fixture. "This place feels like itself again." 6 months after Frank's family moved out, I hosted my first dinner party. Sarah, my old college roommate, drove up from the city with her boyfriend. 2 couples from work joined us, along with Mrs. Patterson from next door, who'd been keeping an eye on the house during the renovation. "This is gorgeous," Sarah said, walking through the kitchen and living areas. "You can't even tell it's the same place from the photos you used to show me." She was right. The house that had felt cramped and overdone during Frank's occupation now felt spacious and serene. Every room reflected choices I'd made, colors and textures and furniture that made sense to me. "To new beginnings," Mrs. Patterson said, raising her wine glass as we gathered around the dining table Dad had built himself. "And to making a house a home again." Making a house a home. That's exactly what I'd done, but it was more than that. I'd made myself at home in my own life. Through Mrs. Patterson, I'd heard that Mom's pregnancy scare had turned out to be a false alarm caused by stress from the move. Part of me felt relief that she didn't have to navigate another baby during such chaos. After everyone left, I sat on my back patio with a cup of tea, looking out over the garden where tiny green shoots were just starting to emerge from the soil. The house was quiet around me, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind of silence that comes from being exactly where you belong. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, my heart clenched, thinking it might be Mom or Frank reaching out after all these months. Instead, it was a message from my old college friend David. "Saw your renovation photos on social media. Place looks amazing. Mind if I stop by next time I'm in town?" I smiled and typed back, "Anytime. There's always room at my table for people who know how to appreciate good things." And there was. My table, in my house, with my rules about who was welcome and who had earned the right to be there. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for your own space in your own life, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about finding the courage to put yourself first. Sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the permission to build a life that's actually yours.